Speaker. I'm really pleased today to have the opportunity to address my honourable colleagues on support of this new legislation. First, I'd like to speak about the principles of sustainable development and Bill C-57 and how these will help to advance the government's commitment to a clean environment and a strong economy. Guelph has a long history of enacting sustainable policies. Personally, I worked for 5 years on the Mayor's Task Force for Sustainability, and I've since focused my goals in the House here around the triple bottom line approach and balancing economic, environmental, and social development. Mr. Speaker, Guelph is a living monument to our government's mantra that you cannot separate success in the environment and success in the economy. They are, in fact, one and the same. Guelph is known for its economic success, including low unemployment and a rapid growth in our economy. In fact, Guelph is one of the fastest growing economies in Canada. But it's also one of the most environmentally conscious. We have the highest waste diversion from landfills at 68%. We have the lowest water consumption per capita with the goal of reaching Norway's level. And as we grow our population by 50%, we're looking to reduce our electrical consumption by the same amount so that we don't require more power for the 50% more people coming in. Mr. Speaker, another key objective of Bill C-57 is poverty reduction. Guelph is actively working to eliminate poverty with a focus on homelessness and mental health. Currently, the Guelph-Wellington Task Force for Poverty Elimination is a shining example of our community's dedication to eliminate poverty in our community. Their 3-year strategic plan from 2013 to 2017 addresses issues like food and income security, housing, and dental health. These social objectives are essential to sustainable development, and this was acknowledged by the UN in the early 1980s. It all connects, Mr. Speaker. Let me continue with some global history. In 1983, the United Nations General Assembly established the World Commission on Environmental and Development. It was chaired by the Norwegian Prime Minister Brundtland, and in 1987, the Brundtland Commission published its report, Our Common Future, known as the Brundtland Report. That report put sustainable development squarely on the global agenda. In its own words, humanity has the ability to make development sustainable, to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is often referred to as the standard definition of sustainable development. Indeed, that is how sustainable development is defined in our current Federal Sustainable Development Act. The Brundtland Report paved the way for an unprecedented 1992 United Nations conference in Rio de Janeiro, better known as the Earth Summit. Mr. Speaker, I want to make a special point of noting that it was a very great, distinguished Canadian who helped to organize that event. It was the late Morris Strong. The Earth Summit brought together more countries and heads of state than any previous event. It also established enduring and lasting mechanisms for international cooperation, in following through the Gro Harlem Brundtland's vision of a sustainable future. Among these important agreements were the UN Framework, Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the development of the Commission on Sustainable Development. And Canada was there. We supported the 1992 Rio Declaration. We've championed sustainable development ever since that time. Following Rio in 1995, Canada became one of the first countries in the world to create a Commissioner for Sustainable Development. Since 1997, government departments have been required to produce sustainable development strategies in compliance with the 1995 amendments to the Auditor General Act. In 2008, under the leadership of the Honourable John Godfrey, his private member's Bill C-474 passed and became law as the Federal Sustainable Development Act. The Act provides the legal framework for developing and implementing the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy every 3 years. It also requires 26 departments and agencies to prepare their own sustainable development strategies that comply and contribute to the overall federal strategy. 2015 was a watershed year. In September, Canada was among 193 countries to adopt the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 2030 Agenda sets out a global framework of action for people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership over the next decade and a half to eradicate poverty and to leave no one behind. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 associated targets build on the previous Millennium Development Goals. They're universally applicable and fully integrate social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. In December 2015, Canada was among the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which adopted the historic Paris Agreement. Mr. Speaker, the Federal Sustainable Development Act is part of the legacy that began under the Brundtland Report and Earth Summit, and is still relevant today as we advance the government's commitment to a clean environment and a strong economy. It provides the framework to develop and implement the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, the complete guide to the Government of Canada's environmental sustainability priorities. The most recent strategy for the period 2016 to 2019 was tabled in this House on October 6th of this year. It sets out 13 long-term aspirational goals. In response to the recommendation of the Standing Committee, the strategy's goals are a Canadian reflection of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals with a focus on their environmental dimensions. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to take a few minutes to tell my colleagues about the principles we're proposing in Bill C-57, principles that this government believes will strengthen the Federal Sustainable Development Act. I also want to acknowledge the important work of our colleagues on the Standing Committee of Environmental and Sustainable Development, who in their June 2016 report highlighted the importance of modernizing our sustainable development principles. Bill C-57 proposes to include the following principles: intergenerational poverty, polluter pays, internalization of costs, openness and transparency, involving Indigenous peoples, collaboration, and results and delivery. The principle of intergenerational equity is the essence of sustainable development. It is the recognition that decisions were made not just about today and about us, but also about the future and those who will be here after us. The Brundtland Report set out the following principle on intergenerational equity: states shall conserve and use the environment and natural resources for the benefit of the present and the future generations. It was also recommended in the Standing Committee's June 2016 report that the principle of polluter pays be adopted, that we look at a new way of thinking, that sustainable economic growth must take into account the damages imposed on the environment. Polluter pays meant that those who generate pollution should bear the cost of creating pollution. Internalization of costs means goods and services should reflect all the costs that generate for society from their design to their consumption and their final disposal. The principles of openness and transparency are also intertwined with the purpose of Federal Sustainable Development Act, ensuring that decision-making related to sustainable development is more transparent and that it's subject to the accountability of Parliament. That's why Bill C-57 proposes a principle on involving all peoples and being transparent to all peoples. I also note that the government's commitment is supported by the provisions in the Act to expand Aboriginal representation on the Sustainable Development Advisory Council. So finally, Mr. Speaker, the principles we set out in Bill C-57 reaffirm that we're up to the challenge. Canada, like Guelph, is ready to seize the opportunities before us and to be bold. Sustainable development means growing a diversified, low-carbon economy while reducing emissions, generating good jobs for Canadians, and having a society that we can all be proud of. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for his speech. But the Conservative government enacted the Federal Sustainable Development Act in 2008 as a result of a Liberals member's private bill, and we invested in clean technology. The Conservative government reduced greenhouse gases in transportation and coal-fired electricity, meaningful, realistic reductions, protecting the environment and working with the economy. Yet this week, the Auditor General reported the Liberal government has failed dismally. Mr. Speaker, how does this member think that C-57 will improve with the Liberal government through their dismal record to date?
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Honourable Member across the way. I really enjoy having him on the Industry Committee, and he's been contributing there as he is today in the House. You know, Mr. Speaker, when we had our debates during the campaign, I can always remember in 12 debates there was always a part where the Conservative candidate mentioned the great environmental record, and that's when the crowd groaned. So I have to just introduce that and just imagine the crowd groaning today that the greenhouse gas reductions happened during a period of the worst economic decline Canada had seen since the Great Depression. Maybe something to do with consumption dropping with the economy was more to the point. But really what we're looking at is how do we enact legislation, how do we work with our partners in the provinces and the municipalities to drive our plan forward and get real results. It's early in the game, but we know we're going to get there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his comments. And just in light of the work that has been done by the standing committee that he referenced for a short bit in his speech, I'm wondering if the member is at all concerned because C-57's amendments don't completely meet the recommendations of the committee, and as a matter of fact, they put forward some recommendations that were not raised at the committee, which is of concern. And I'm wondering in particular if he'd like to expand a little bit on why that might be that the committee wasn't asked to weigh in and make recommendations, particularly when we're looking at the legal framework for developing our federal sustainable development strategy.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Honourable Member from Windsor West for her intervention. I haven't been involved with the committee directly, but, Mr. Speaker, I can say that the work of committees comes from the committee to the government. The government looks at the priorities of the whole of government approach, if you will, Mr. Speaker, and works with the recommendations from committees to engage the whole of government. Sometimes all recommendations are taken, sometimes not all recommendations are taken based on how they fit in with the whole of government approach. But I might also say, Mr. Speaker, that it is early in the game and that we have taken the most important priorities from the committee to move forward and work with our provincial and municipal counterparts to engage and to get the goals that we want to achieve.
Questions and comments. We have the time for a 30-second question and comment and a 30-second answer. The Honourable Member for Cloverdale, Langley City.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague for his comments. As somebody who sits on the Environment and Sustainable Development Committee, I can say how pleased I am with the government's response. Many of our recommendations made it into the legislation, and many of the ones that aren't directly in the legislation will be actioned through other means. So I think that the government has responded very appropriately. With that as a preamble, I just wanted to ask the member how he feels his community will benefit from this, from C-57 and the legislation that's going forward.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
That's a tough question, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the member from Cloverdale, Langley City, for challenging me on that. When we look at our community, as I mentioned, has a sustainable development plan already, and now we're moving into the action items that will align with the federal plan, and then bringing the province on board so that all three orders of government will work together to achieve Canada's goals together. Thank you.